Namaste and good morning if you're in the States, and welcome no matter where you are in the world. I'm Sunita Vishwanath, one of the co-founders of Hindus for Human Rights. Welcome to our fifth Baithak for Liberation. I'm so excited that we're now in our fifth installment. Throughout this series, we have brought together scholars, practitioners, and community leaders to imagine the ways that Hindu traditions can be reclaimed and reinterpreted as living and liberatory practices, aligned with struggles against caste, patriarchy, and all forms of oppression. A reminder that our Baithaks are an opportunity to slow down and dig deeper into the overarching question: what does a truly liberatory modern day Hinduism, one which has no room for caste or any other bigotry, actually look like concretely in our lives today? Today, we turn to what may be the most fundamental dimension of our spiritual and social lives: birth and death. Hindu thought and practice have placed these universal, deeply sacred, and intimate moments at the center of ritual, philosophy, and ethical reflection. And yet, across our history, birth and death have been sites where caste and patriarchy determine whose bodies are considered pure enough for ritual honor, who is permitted to participate in sacred rites, and who is deemed worthy of liberation, moksha itself. This Baithak feels extremely personal to me. I lost my beloved mother-in-law just a few months ago, and in the past few years, I lost both fathers-in-law I have been blessed with in my life. My parents are in their 90s. I am a doting mother of three, and I will be a grandmother in just a few months. So I find myself right in the middle of these two life bookends, searching and seeking. In particular, I yearn for a liberatory Hindu way to welcome my first grandchild and ultimately bid farewell to a good life. And there was the day I spent on Manikarnika Ghat in Varanasi with my husband, Stefan, watching the cremations take place continuously. It was devastating to be witness to people's pain at the loss of their loved ones, but it was even more devastating to be witness to the injustice of these cremations. Caste difference was apparent, as was economic disparity. Poor and so-called lower caste families had cremation pyres with much less firewood, and the bodies were treated without respect. We even saw skulls and other bones being kicked around. And there were very few women among the families attending the cremations of their loved ones. And so today we will sit with the profound questions that birth and death raise within our tradition. We will examine how rituals around these life cycle moments have been shaped by structures of caste and patriarchy, and how they might instead be reclaimed as spaces for love, inclusion, and dignity. Together, we will imagine what it means to welcome life and honor death in ways that reflect the deepest values of a liberatory Hinduism, one that affirms every body, every story, and every soul. Our moderator for today is Aminta Kilawan-Narine, an attorney, community activist, and writer, and a singer. Born in the Bronx, New York, to Guyanese parents, Aminta's passion for social justice manifests in various aspects of her life. In 2011, she co-founded Sadhana, along with, I'm proud to say, me and Rohan Narayan, to merge her activist spirit with her love for Hinduism's progressive values. Aminta is a spirited bhajan and Hindi film song singer. She serves on the board of her local temple, the Sri Trimurti Bhavan in Queens, New York. And in 2020, Aminta founded South Queens Women's March, a local gender justice organization striving to promote equity, particularly among South Asian and Indo-Caribbean women in South Queens, New York City. Aminta holds a BA from Fordham University and a JD from Fordham University School of Law. She is licensed to practice law in New York State and currently serves as senior legislative attorney at the New York City Council. Aminta has been my earliest and dearest colleague on this journey to a liberatory Hinduism, and I'm thrilled to welcome her here. And I have two special requests. One, Aminta, that you start us off with song, and two, that you weave in your own personal experiences and community traditions as an Indo-Caribbean Hindu. Over to you, dearest Aminta.
Thank you so much, Sunita. Namaste, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. First, I'm going to take note of Sunita's two requests. I'm not going to say yes or no just yet to at least one of them, but I'll do my best. And I first just want to say how privileged and honored I am to be hosting this conversation today. Thank you so much to Hindus for Human Rights to believe that I am even worthy of moderating this conversation. I have been following HfHR's work since its inception, and I have also been so honored to be on this journey of activism and advocacy with people like Sunita, who I consider my activist mentor, somebody who I've taught, who's taught me everything about what it means to be unapologetically just and stand up for what's right, even if that's scary, even if that defies the norms that we've been taught since birth. And so I give so much thanks and gratitude to Suni for everything that she's done to support me on this journey. I am a lifelong practicing Hindu. My parents hail from Guyana, so they were twice removed from the motherland of India. And as a result, we have held on so tightly to our cultural heritage and our religious principles. And growing up, I did not realize the ways in which um, things that I never thought paved the way in my Indo-Caribbean Hindu community actually did. And that includes Hindu nationalism. It includes certain practices that I don't believe belong in my faith or actually are honoring that faith and that legacy. And it wasn't until sadhana and work with Sunita and others that I realized some of this was so insidious to even my community in the Indo-Caribbean South Queens community. And so it is with great honor that I am here to explore some of the deepest topics that we think about on a day-to-day basis, birth and death. And these have, of course, touched all of us, all of our lives. Naturally speaking, we are all here and we will all go one day. Personally, I have experienced birth and death in various aspects. I will be vulnerable in saying that I've struggled with pregnancy loss over many years. I just had two babies, but it was not easy to do that. My son is actually my eighth child, technically speaking, because I've lost seven before him, including our daughter, baby Gita, who passed away the day she was born. But so she was born alive, right? I often think to myself, what happens to a soul as pure as baby Gita's? She was here, and what is her karma, right? And it's something that I grapple with, and I don't have the answers to these questions. I myself, as somebody that grew up in the Indo-Caribbean Hindu community, have also considered what it could look like to become a priest, and support people in times of great happiness and great sadness in their lives. However, never thought that that space could be for me because of my caste, although I don't even know exactly what my caste is, but I know I'm not Brahmin, and also because of my gender. So these things seem prohibitive. And I am also the eldest of three daughters in my parents' household. And so what happens when they pass on? What is my place as it pertains to their funeral rites? I am one of the closest people to them, and my heart would probably be closest to the rituals that need to be performed. However, it would be looked at with complete shock um, if I attempted to do that. And so these are things that I have to grapple with as a woman, as as somebody who has sometimes been pushed out of leadership roles as well in my faith spaces. and as somebody that is trying to shift those narratives myself. So to say that I'm excited for this conversation is to say the least. As a moderator, I'm also here to listen and to learn from two incredible panelists who we have the honor of being joined by today. Our first panelist is Pandit Dr. Raja Gopal Bhattar, an internationally recognized higher education leader, advocate, and author. Pandit Raja comes from a long line of Hindu scholars and is a proud queer and gender non-conforming spiritual practitioner. They hold a PhD and a Master of Arts degree in higher education and organizational change from UCLA, and have been featured in outlets like NPR, BBC, and others. They are also the author of Queering Constellations, Mapping This Journey Called Life in 2025, an interactive memoir of their experience as a queer Hindu Buddhist immigrant told through letters, poetry, art, and stories. I definitely have to read it. And our other panelist is Dr. Punya Upadhyaya, an HfHR co-founder and member of the board of directors of this organization. He works in the areas of leadership and culture with Fortune 500 firms, Native American nations, NGOs, colleges, and other institutions across the globe. He is deeply aware of the power of religion as a true source of transformation and renewal from years of being blessed by his guru and spending time drinking chai at his Baba's ashram. And his Bollywood song for the work of HfHR is Madhubala singing, जब प्यार किया तो डरना क्या जब प्यार किया तो डरना क्या प्यार किया प्यार किया कोई चोरी नहीं की प्यार किया. And I will say no more, but it means why fear when you're in love? You're in love, and that's not a crime, right? So, perfect song for the work of HfHR. And Punyaji looks forward to the power of beauty, music, and gods and goddesses to replenish our worlds. And so we are going to begin this conversation and talk through some of these concepts. And I'm going to start with a question and I hope it's okay that I respectively call you Rajaji and Punyaji. Although you have such illustrious backgrounds, and I feel like I'm not doing justice by calling you Pandit Dr. G and Dr. G. But anyway, so first for Punyaji. So the concepts of birth, Janma, death, Mrityu, and liberation, Moksha, lie at the heart of Hindu philosophical discourse, and they shape its metaphysical, ethical, and theological horizons. From the early Vedic hymns to the Upanishadic revelation of the Atman and its relation to Brahman, Hindu thought has wrestled with the meaning of what is embodied existence, the continuity of consciousness, and the possibility of the ultimate release at the end of this all. These ideas are elaborated across the various schools of philosophy, Vedanta, Sankhya, Yoga, and others, with completing claims about the nature of the self and its path to transcendence. So there's karma and samsara, which offer a causal explanation for the cycle of birth and death. But moksha is imagined as a total rupture of this cycle, the state of knowledge, absorption, freedom, or closeness to the divine, which I know we hope we all can one day achieve. But these conceptual systems didn't evolve just like that. They didn't evolve in a vacuum. They were shaped by reinscribed social hierarchies. And unfortunately, they privileged certain bodies, voices, and experiences. The metaphysical centrality of moksha in elite Hindu traditions has been critiqued and reimagined by thinkers, rightfully so, who emphasize not just liberation from rebirth, but liberation now within our lives themselves as it stands. And that means liberation from suffering, subjugation, and injustice. There are bhakti saints, anti-caste thinkers like B.R. Ambedkar, in their own way, who interrogated and really tried to unearth the premises and limits to these very concepts. So, Punyaji, if you can tell us about the ways in which the core Hindu concepts of birth, death, and liberation evolved across the philosophical traditions, from the Vedas to current modern day Hindu thought. How do Hindus currently think about these concepts, and how are they related to one another? And I know that's a loaded question, so hopefully we can unpack that.
Cool. Namaste. Thank you very much, Aminta. Lovely to meet you. And just call me Punya. I'm massively Americanized, and even in India, I didn't like titles and stuff. This Indian habit of calling everyone sir and madam is like, good gods. And part of it, I think, is because of the sense of hypocrisy, right? That there is, you have to go quote unquote respect your elders, even when they are not respectable. And I think that that sense of hypocrisy is part of what I want to address today, because I think that's what shapes a lot of how we engage with birth and death. What I'd like to begin with is I'd like to begin with a story. By the way, thank you very much for singing. That is my absolute favorite song, and thank you so much for bringing that to life. And the story I want to tell you, and this is not PG rated, guys. So if anyone's got kids around, please, this is about birth and death. So, the Indians, I think post the British, Indians became far more prudish, but the early Indians were not prudish. And this is part of that storytelling tradition, right? And it began because in my 10th or 11th grade, I went into my dad and I said, Papa, what's there before the beginning? And he looked at me and said, what do you mean? And I said, well, we've all heard about the Big Bang and stuff, but what happens before? How does reality get born? How does, because that's the first birth, right? Our human births and our births as other beings come much after. What's the first birth? And so he thought about it and gave me a book. And this book broke my brain for a while. I was young. I had not really studied Hindu philosophy at all. Hindu philosophy was things done by weird pundits chanting things that I couldn't understand, and people making claims that had no real factual basis, and lots of miracles and saints and stuff. And I was like, really? So this book was Speaking of Shiva by Stella Kramish. Stella Kramish wrote the definitive book on the Hindu temple decades ago. But this book, Speaking of Shiva, is all about Lord Shiva, who's one of my favorite gods. And so this starts off, let me just start with the story. And this is the time before time. So this is the darkness before darkness. There are layers of darkness, and there is nothing happening because there is no place for anything to happen. There is no time for something to happen. There is no before, there is no after. And in this time, though, there are the gods. And Brahma is sitting there, and his tapasya, his meditation, his focus, internal focus, is creating the world. Or maybe. We don't know, because we don't know what's happening. And as he focuses and meditates, different aspects of reality emanate from him. And the first things that emanate are some of his sons. And then the one that emanates is his daughter, Usha, who's known as the dawn. And if you actually read the Vedas, which most Indians don't, most Indians will genuflect towards the Vedas and then keep going on to whatever Puranic story they know. Usha is actually one of the most powerful and popular goddesses in the Vedas. She's all over the Vedas. You talk about her, the Rig Veda talks about her again and again as an invocation of beauty and power and so on. So one, you remember that as you think about Usha. A part of what happens with Usha is that she is insanely desirable. Like she is just, oh my God. And watching her, Brahma's sons actually get distracted. This is from a different story version, and they all ejaculate. And Brahma looks at them and starts laughing and says, oh, you poor people, you have no self-control. You have no ability to actually show up and, be with reality. Like, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed, So obviously you can tell a doting dad and, very kind and supportive. But then he looks at Usha and is overcome by desire. And so he reaches out to her and they hold hands and they walk away and they start making love. Again, this is the time before time. There are no social norms. There are no social things. There is no one else, right? The whole question, like, who did Adam and Eve's children marry, right? And we all ask that as kids after you heard the story of Genesis. So the question is, as they're doing this, however, there is the hunter, and he's the hunter in the skies. And one of his names is Shiva. But the other name is the one that comes now, Rudra, the howling one, the howler. He looks at this and is appalled. And we don't know why he's appalled. We don't know if this is because they are father and daughter, if this is because it's unnatural, if this is because the presence of desire. We don't know why he is appalled, but he's appalled. And he howls. He's the howling one. He's the one whose scream reverberates across the cosmos, across consciousness, across reality. And he grabs his bow and arrow and he shoots at Prajapati, at Brahma. And he shoots him just as he's about to ejaculate. And he bucks out and the semen falls, and it falls through layers and layers and layers and layers till it hits Mother Earth. And that's where creation begins. So that is the birth of creation. One of the side effects of this is Usha is embarrassed that she was rejected at this moment, and she runs away to the east blushing, which is why the dawn is pink. And that's, why the color comes, and that's how, and of course, she claims her beauty and her power as she goes on. Yes, I see in the text that that is the book, The Presence of Shiva. And this is how reality starts coming into being. And I think that what's very important is that sense of, we need some level of order, some level of structure to live, because if you have only chaos, there is no life. But I think that there's a way in which Indian society, over years and centuries of layering on manners, tends to start forgetting where it comes from. It comes from this beautiful, messy, unethical, immoral, violent, loving, desire-filled, joyous experience. And I think that part of our job is, in some ways, to unpack, but in other ways, really to claim and proclaim the joy, the beauty, the messiness of birth and death, of saying that, we live and die in ways that are human and full, and that other people's rules are interesting and sometimes amusing, but not really relevant. And that the presence of the gods and goddesses in our daily lives, and this is the point of moksha, by the way, just to come back. Moksha is often seen as a caricature. People see it as this, I will now be holy, and I'm now going to sit here and go meditate. That's not moksha. Moksha, like Adi Shankara, who's one of our role models of this, walked all over India and debated people and set up temples and did everything you can imagine. My guru, Neem Karoli Baba, walked all over India, saved lives, created temples, created hostels, set up toilets all across rural India. He was like, no, people need toilets because this is killing them, right? So this is in the 40s and 50s. He was setting up toilets all over India. So as you look at teachers, people who are actually with moksha, not in the caricature, they're alive and they are awake and they are reaching out to say, live fully, wholly who you are. Don't hurt others, but don't be defined by others. I think that's really the point of birth, is when we say, I'm not defined by others. I'm defined by the reality that we are in. I'm defined by the sense of joy and the blessing that I receive.
Thank you so much, Punyaji. All of that, I'd never heard that story before. And you would think this is something that is so foundational to Hinduism, yet I never heard it, and I'm sure many have not. So thank you so much for sharing that and sharing it as beautifully as you did. And I know somebody flagged the book in the chat, so thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think that what challenging what it is we think moksha is ultimately is very important too. Growing up myself, I've always seen the journey towards moksha to be a very introspective one, and honestly somewhat of a selfish one. But I don't think that we need to perceive it that way, and I think we actually need to perceive it a different way. For I mean, that journey works for some, but I think for most, the journey towards moksha is one that involves others and it involves doing good on this planet. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm gonna now turn it over to Rajaji. So this following question is for Rajaji. So rituals surrounding birth and death, or the sacraments, to be conducted depending on your life stage, which we all are familiar with, have been very central to Hindu life, and they function as the key sites where many of our metaphysical beliefs, social norms, and material practices converge and come together. These rituals, also known as samskaras, the rites after birth, for example, the naming ceremony, the first outing ceremony, and ultimately the last rites, antyesti, derive from early Vedic texts and were codified to structure these life cycle events according to specific labels, caste being one, gender being one, household status being another. But these rituals are undergirded by notions of purity, shuddhi, and impurity, ashuddhi, particularly making bodies like the female body and bodies of those performing the death-related tasks being deemed as polluting or ritually dangerous towards the sanctity of the ritual itself, right? It's just very frustrating, personally, as a woman, to see that, and as somebody that arguably, I know I'm not Brahmin, right? Like I said, and that's the thing with being Indo-Caribbean, just as a sidebar, is just that I think that the caste was retained quite obviously and quite conveniently amongst those who identified as Brahmin. But the rest of us, and I think that's also to perpetuate certain power cycles, right? But for the rest of us, it wasn't as important necessarily. So, but it does prohibit us from entering certain types of roles. Anyways, sorry, sidebar. But when we're concerned with the transitions of life and death, ultimately what ends up happening is these rituals perpetuate certain injustices and certain discriminatory practices. They perpetuate upholding Brahminical order, privileging male upper caste authorities as the sole mediator for sacred knowledge and for ritual efficacy, and sanctity, honestly. And in my own life's work, like I said, I found this so frustrating. I know in my community, there are very qualified Hindu panditas who are not allowed to sit on what we call I think, I don't know if others call this, but we call it the Singhasan, in our spaces, and they're not allowed to sit there because they're impure or perceived as impure. They're not allowed to deliver pravachans on the basis of the fact of that, and that they're menstruators, and that surrounds all of our rituals, unfortunately. So in contemporary Hindu practice, many of these rituals, especially those surrounding birth and death, continue to reflect exclusionary assumptions. Women, for one, are denied full participation in funeral rituals. Dalit communities are expected to perform labor associated with death, but they're simultaneously and ironically excluded from its sacred dimensions. And caste-marked priesthoods often dictate who's allowed to perform or even present during significant moments of transition, right? And all the while, modern reinterpretations of these rights do exist, especially within the anti-caste and feminist movements and frameworks. But much of mainstream Hindu ritual life still remain deeply enmeshed, deeply entangled with the cosmology of the hierarchy and the control. Um, I will say that in our community, and folks here probably know of one of our female Hindu priestesses, who comes from a line of Brahmin priests, but is still not welcomed in many spaces because she's a woman and identifies as such, right? So that's deeply problematic. And also is queer. And that's a whole, and Rajaji, we can talk about this as well. It opens a whole floodgate of other concerns. So how have Hindu rituals surrounding birth and death historically developed to uphold caste and gender hierarchies? And in what ways do these rituals continue to function as mechanisms of exclusion that privilege upper caste male authorities while marginalizing others from access to sacred power and ritual participation and leadership?
I feel like we need a deep breath after that question. Aminta ji, thank you for the great question, and thank you for holding this space. I'm incredibly honored. I don't feel an expert on this, but one of the things that's really important about Hinduism, we don't have to be an expert to do the work. We have to be able to be intentional, and I think intentionality is the core of the why we do something. When we do the sankalp, when we do any ritual, is so important. We start with the sankalp, which is the intention setting, because it's about what you're going to do, and to be able to actually share it openly without shame is really critical, and that's how we reclaim some of the power. And so the intentionality, I hope, will come through today. And that's why I wanted to, at the very beginning, when Sunita ji asked me, I was like, I don't know if I feel good enough to be, but I was like, you know what, we bring our heart, and if we bring our heart, we cannot be wrong, because God is in our heart, right? And our heart is God. But I think the question is such a, I'm going to say loaded question, for lack of any other word, right? Because there's so many layers to it. There are kind of the practices that kind of predate Vedic histories. Then there's kind of the Vedic mentions of rituals, but then there's a codification that happens much later on. And there's kind of the current contemporary patriarchal practices that have been reified to kind of uphold power, and there's kind of the current practices. So it's kind of this interesting full circle of oppression and misinterpretation, if you will, right? So because the actual Vedas, and there's a couple of mentions of different rituals here and there, but there's not actually a clear treatise on what rituals are, what and what they look like, and who they're for, etc. In these particular texts, they're kind of mentioned different, but they're kind of and then pulled together and stitched together by people later on to feel like, oh, this is what it looks like. But we also know that, like, at least in a lot of the rituals that I officiate, I often tell people, I can tell you what the Vedas and kind of the scriptures tell me what a ritual can look like, but then I'll tell you none of the rituals look the same because every family, every community, every region has its own interpretation, which means that, like, we don't have the need for patriarchal purificational power is not necessary because we don't have one way to do anything, and that's okay, and that's actually the beauty of it. So there's that piece I think that's really important to talk about, and then really it's about even in the samskars that you talk about, the various rituals. So I'm gonna get to there. I'm gonna have a long journey to get to your answer. But even the samskaras that we say, there's a 16 samskara that the 16 kind of rites of passage every human is supposed to go through. Those are pretty recent. If you think of the 16, some say there's 40, some say there's 11, some say there's 12, some say there's just 22. So different texts have different numbers, and different branches of Hinduism have different numbers. So there's also this, like, this is not a divine, like, whatever supreme godhead said there's 16 and we're going to go with 16, but there's actually, like, different reasons for why we ended up with 16 that were just more convenient than others, right? And then that they may not actually make sense for everyone. So there's that part of it that, like, I would say even take that with a grain of salt. Like, even these samskaras, even the word samskara as we think of it today is not mentioned in the Vedas, right? The Vedas talk about samskara as a set of beliefs and practices, but not in the ritualistic way that we think of them now, right? The idea of samskara being kind of the more contemporary, right? Some also being the same root of Sanskrit. Like, it is part of the Aryan Indoification of these rituals that really made us the codification of these rituals was a way of controlling power, right? And controlling kind of who is or who's not allowed to. Because once you set the rules, you can then control the game. And so that was kind of part of the process of creating this hierarchy of caste, and the way that caste was kind of built into who and how rituals can be. Then there's a whole piece around kind of who is born a Brahmin versus a Dalit versus other identities, right? People go to the Manusmriti and talk about how God talks about, and even the Rig Veda, right? Vishnu talks about, the 4 parts of human and where people come from. But then at the same time, in the same scriptures also talk about, like, we all start off as Dalits, and then that's not the word that they use, but I'm not going to use the S word, right? And so interesting, but also if biologically, we've known that, like, all humans are born female first and then create male genetics afterwards. And so this interesting that, like, there's a need to shun kind of our origins, which feels very antithetical to Hinduism, right? And so if we're all born as Dalits and we all have this kind of foundational core energy, what is that? One, do we believe in the hierarchy and the system, and that is there an evolutionary piece to it? I don't know. But it's interesting that, like, our scriptures say it's being kind of all these different quote unquote caste identities or varnas, right, are part of our being and our DNA and spirit. And yet there's also this need to detach and kind of shun these layers as part of this sense of what is evolution, what is spiritual evolution look like, which is, I think, seems contradictory. And then to go into Punyaji's point around this whole idea of moksha, right? Moksha is not just an individual practice. It's actually a spiritual communal practice as well, right? If you think about the wedding rituals, one of the 4 purusha, the purpose of human marriage in Hindu tradition, one of them is moksha. Is to say you're not partners just for the physical thing, but you're actually supposed to be spiritual partners and help each other evolve through the 7 lifetimes together. Why is that important, right? What does that mean for us? And so the idea that moksha and elevation, spiritual elevation or spiritual progress needs to be a communal event. It needs to have kind of accountability partners, if you will, right, for us to be able to do this work. And that's why this work and the idea that these satsangs and conversations, and why so many of our philosophies and theories come from dialogue and questioning, and that the ability to engage in dialogue and to challenge is actually part of, for me, what it means to be a good Hindu. in whatever that looks like. And then thinking about there's so much that you talked about this, Aminta ji, that there's so much focus on the purity politics of like who is pure, who is not pure, why is, and where does this come from, right? If you think about the menstrual cycles and the 3 days of being impure, and what does that mean that like we're going through bodily functions, and that the release of there's something connected to life and death. It's kind of a fear of not wanting to talk about death, because if in releasing blood, you're releasing life potentially, right? And so this is interesting. So we're actually so concerned about death, and the fear of death, I would think, is actually where this purity practice comes from, that we need to then like make it evil so we don't have to think about it. And so if we think about death as evil, which was a much more of a Western practice anyway than it is an Eastern practice, because for us death is just another stop on the train ride, right? It's just another, and there's so many different train rides and so many different stops ahead, that why are we so concerned with death, and what does that look like? So there's that piece of it. And then there's the political practice of power, of like who gets to actually own property, right? And death. And so like the fact that like a widow, when her husband happened to die, which also has always annoyed me, that like a woman cannot marry someone else after, unless it's his brother or whatever. But then a man can marry whoever he wants, right? And there's not the same practice. There's these 16 symbols of womanhood of when you're married, right? And so, and when your husband dies, there's this really wretched practice where other widows come around and actually will break all those 16 symbols away from you. And it's just this dehumanizing experience. It's like, it doesn't, like, I don't understand. We're already in this sort of deep pain, and you're going to make them kind of this public shaming, if you will, and this kind of removal of your auspiciousness and whatever that looks like. So I think it's just, it feels inhuman, which feels very antithetical to, again, what is the spiritual purpose of that? I have no spiritual understanding. I have not been, at least in my 25 years of looking at that, I have not been able to understand, like, what is the spiritual purpose of shaming a woman when her husband has just died? I mean, at least it's better than putting her in the fire and killing her, as we used to do before, right? And yet we don't conveniently talk about that. If you think about, particularly the folks that are more staunch Orthodox followers of some of the Vedic rituals and the various karmas, right? They somehow obviously forget that conveniently. Then there's a practice of like the woman still lying on the pyre with her husband, and then her being walked away, which is also really weird, right? Of this, like, somehow the woman does not have the ability to detach from her husband, because somehow she has to be cooked through by another man. And this dehumanization of women itself feels really interesting. Also antithetical when we think about Gayatri, the goddess of knowledge in our culture, is not only a woman, but a 5-headed goddess, right? She's so powerful that she had to be like, the reason that many of our gods have more than 2 hands, more than human form, and more multiple heads and multiple hands, is because they're beyond our human. They're more powerful than us. If they look like us, then we're the same as gods, right? And so if she has 5 heads and 10 arms and all these different, so she's clearly greater than our consciousness. So how are we then treating women both in this divine pedestal, but at the same time also dehumanization at the same? So that's interesting, right? We're not even talking about castes. We're just talking about basic structures. And then you go into thinking about who is allowed to officiate the ceremonies, right? He talks about like often being you talked about this, Aminta ji, right? What does it mean that, like, particularly women and women who are daughters who are married off and not have less days of ashuddhi, right? Of kind of dirtiness than the children. I was like, they're still your children, right? The reason that pretty one of my favorite parts of the Hindu wedding itself is when the bride walks down, it's the mother's brother that walks you down, right? To remind you that that's also part of your family. And so we want to reify these relationships, and yet at the same time, you have less risk because you're somehow married off to some other person and you're treated as property, right? And what does it mean that, like, a daughter does not mourn less her parent than a son does, except for maybe because he gets more wealth and prosperity passed down than she does. But then it becomes your mourning and your relationship is based on an economical process and not an emotional process, which feels awkward and strange. And then really thinking about how let's see, where am I going to go like this? Oh, even the idea of Ashuddhi and how long people have Ashuddhi also different, right? So there's this really interesting concentric circles of the people that are kind of in the most nuclear family have more days of Ashuddhi. Typically, the sons and parents, if sometimes, and children often are about like 10 to 13 days of Ashuddhi when someone dies, right? And then if it's a married daughter, it's like less days. And the farther you go in relation, the less it gets, which is interesting. But even within that, Brahmins have the lowest days of Ashuddhi, whereas like Dalits have the longest, almost up to a month, which is really interesting. Like why, like so it's, if death is death, or because Krishna, right? It says you're all the same. There's no difference in me because you're all in me and you come back to me. And so if we say there's no difference, and yet in birth and death, whether it's a Dalit woman who's giving birth, who has more days to be Ashuddhi, right? Who's often isolated in conditions that are not healthy. And it's whereas Brahmins don't. And so often it's but awkward. So interesting, there's this why the difference in days, like what is the impurity that's required more days to kind of become more clean, and at the same time also connected to cleanliness and kind of living conditions that has been created by the society that you're recognizing. So it's this interest, we recognize that there's an inadequate and inequitable treatment of Dalits and the ways their living conditions are giving economic conditions versus the way that Brahmins are and the way they have access to resources and cleanliness, etc. And so we recognize that because we have different days of Ashuddhi, and yet we're actually then not addressing the structure that's created that. So that feels interestingly contradictory to me in that space. All that to say, and then what you said, around the fact that there was actually a case in India a couple of years ago where a Dalit woman was actually literally kicked off her pyre as she was she was supposed to be in an inappropriate burning ground, and her family was forced to take her body to another cremation ground and burn her. Right. And so the dehumanization even in death just feels so vile. And what is the purpose, right? If the same people that profess that God is all and all is God are also treating people in ways that are not godly, then are we actually, to Punyaji's point, worthy of saying G to this point and to honoring, giving the honorific for knowledge and wisdom when that knowledge and wisdom is used to harm? And is that really useful to us if we think about what is the power, right? I think about one of my favorite songs is by this saint in Andhra called Annamacharya, that, he says, Brahma Mukote para Brahma Mukote, that says, God, Brahma, the divine is the same. And the whole song answer, the sun that shines down upon the ant and the king is the same. The shadow that we make is the same. The earth that we sleep on is the same. So why the difference between humans in these different ways? Why are we so worried about restrictions and categorization when we're all born and we're all dead and that nothing exists and everything exists because we're all in the divine? And so how and why do these exist? So I'll stop there. I'm sorry, it was a bit long, but hopefully it made sense.
No, all of it made sense. It made sense, but it didn't make sense. And that's the whole thing. I mean, there's so many contradictions, and it's like, but that's the beauty of Hinduism, I think. I think that we can re-envision what our faith is and really get to the core of it all, which I think is antithetical to a lot of the traditions that have been passed on over time that maybe can't be sourced to what is it, Smriti versus Shruti, right? And that's the next question, right? So what should we actually be following versus what we shouldn't be following, and where are there flexibilities to still be a good Hindu? And maybe that means being a good person foremostly, right? And yet some of these traditions would run afoul of that. And so certainly something to reckon with. I remember with sadhana, we held feminist dialogues because agree that Hinduism, I think at its core, requires dialogue, requires questioning, um, depending on your school of thought. But we had conversations around whether folks who menstruate can officiate ceremonies, can do things like clean the murtis, or what is the role of these individuals, menstruators, and many of us tried to source scripture to see where exactly that rule came from. And we couldn't find anything pointed, right? And I think if we did a deep dive on a lot of these issues, we'd probably end up in that same situation. And
Right.
so
Can I
definitely, yeah, go ahead.
can I add something? No, you just made me really think of something really interesting, Aminta Ji. You know, I had I had two stories. One is a bit more intense. Again, if there's children around, I'm sorry. I had an uncle kind of a distant uncle who passed away maybe about 25 years ago. And his wife actually, I think to comment that Kanan put it in the chat box, his wife actually committed suicide within the 10 days, because if you die within the 10 days, you're still considered Sumangali, right? So the internalization of this need to be so auspicious that like your connection to your husband is so strong that like you cannot think of, and it was not about her living by herself. It's about this idea that being shunned by a culture that forced her that death was easier and more important than living for her children, who were all in their teens at the time, right? And so that was just like, I remember just being one of those moments of like, what are we doing here? Right, moments, right? Of like, is this the rituals? Is this the practice that I really want to be a part of, if this is what it's forcing us to do? The other side, that's, I think, you know, I officiated a wedding last year for a couple, and the groom's father had passed away unexpectedly a couple of months before the wedding. And so they called me and they're like, so do we need, like, can my mother participate, and can we even do the wedding, right? Because it was in the year. And I was like, well, what did your father want? They're like, he was so excited for our wedding. And I was like, okay, and what does your mother want? Well, she wants to be part of the, so like, then she's gonna be part of the wedding because she's your freaking mother, right? She has given you birth, and birth cannot, like, the mother that gives you birth is God, right? That's why we say Matu Deva Baba. What other divine spirit can you have? And so how do you deny your mother from being your own freaking wedding and to be able to be a part of that ritual? I was like, no, she's gonna be part of it, because like it is her birthright, and it is your birthright for her to have. And it was interesting, because I think they were like really scared that I was going to say no. And I was like, I can see the argument to say, no, this is inauspicious, whatever. But it's like, again, if marriage is a sacred sacrament, if that's also defined by God, whatever we define that as, or the sages, if birthing a child is critical to human tradition, and that is an act of divine intervention, where we have all these rituals around birthing, etc., and all these strange rituals as well. We can talk about that another time around birth. And then if all creation comes from the mother goddess, then the mother can never be inauspicious. Like, how that doesn't make sense to me. And so just for me, it was a cool way for me to, the two stories are like just the odd ends of like how to, again, to the question of how do we make sense of the scriptures, the rituals, the historical practices, to the agency that we have, the intention that we bring, which was what actually makes us, I wouldn't even say a good Hindu, but a Hindu.
Yes, absolutely. I am trying to be mindful of time and the chat as well. But just to piggyback off of that for just a second, and thank you, Rajaji, for everything that you just said. I'm thinking of the notion of suicide also, something that we're grappling with in the Indo-Caribbean community right now, because a few weeks ago, there was a young man, 17 years old, who was a Pandit in training at my temple, actually. And um, there's an active investigation, but it's very much very, very, very likely that he committed suicide. But the family does not want to say that, for good reason. I can understand it being a very private thing. But also just thinking about the shame associated with suicide as well, and death, and the fact that there's this question of, well, he was a Hindu priest in training and yet did this, and the question of, why people commit suicide, and the lack of compassion around the fact that maybe it was a result of their suffering, and ending that suffering, and looking at it from a different perspective would be important. But there is this vilifying of the very act itself, and this um, lack of regard for how somebody could have gotten there. And it does make me think about this question of death again too, and the impurity of it. But yet,
Yeah.
contradictions around that. But anyway, we do have to move on to another question. And I know that our end time is 1:30, so we have to keep on moving. I know we had a few other questions, but I'm going to direct the next question to both of you, and I'm hoping that Punyaji can lead us in this question. But so if we take seriously that the dominant Hindu frameworks around life and death, which we've talked about, are deeply implicated by all of the hierarchical and labels and everything like casteism, patriarchy, purity, pollution, etc., then it would also go to say that any attempt to reimagine these frameworks, whether they're conceptually reimagined, theologically, or ritually reimagined, is not just a spiritual or intellectual task, but it's also deeply political. And, in my temple, it's always like, oh, no, you can't bring politics into this. No, it's a no for many. So, but across classical and modern Hindu traditions, these ideas have been used, unfortunately, to naturalize social hierarchies and legitimize, on a religious level, exclusion from birth-based caste discrimination to gendered denial of ritual authority, as we were talking about. So both of you, through your distinct but intersecting commitments and your lifelong work, have been contributing to a growing movement to reclaim Hinduism as a liberatory tradition that is accountable to the oppressed. How do you see the work of reinterpreting Hindu concepts and reconfiguring life cycle ideas and rituals as part of a broader human rights project concerned with justice, not in the hereafter, but also in this life? And what would it mean to build a truly liberatory Hinduism now, in our time, one that treats birth and death not as thresholds for exclusion and control and power, but rather as opportunities to affirm our communal interdependence with one another and dignity for all beings? So I'm going to turn it over to Punyaji and then turn it over to Rajaji afterwards for this question.
So I remember this old saying from the 60s or 70s, right? The personal is the political from the feminist world. And therefore, anything we do is political. And I think that pretending it's not is kind of silly, right? The choice to preserve a hierarchy is political. I think that's something that we need to keep emphasizing, is that no, the choice you're making is political. It's not political. If you're going to support Hindutva, that is political. That is not a quote unquote Hindu or Hindu unity or some rubbish like that. It is actually a choice you're making that is political. My sense of that has been like really twofold, right? One is the ashram I help take care of. And up here in Taos, New Mexico, we have this Hanuman temple, my Gurudev's ashram. It was set up by a bunch of hippies who returned from India in the 60s and 70s and had fallen in love with our Gurudev. And they set up this temple. And there are times you go inside there and people would be like, what's going on? Like, conservative Orthodox Hindus, because it's different. And there are some things we've cleaned up and some things we've not. So, for example, people still get upset, but every Sunday, every Saturday, every Sunday, I'll tell 40 to 100 Indian women that they can touch Hanumanji. And most of them are shocked and delighted. And a few of them will still not do it because it's like too taboo. And I'm like, that's fine. It's an offering. It's not a compulsion. But we've created this space where women dress Hanumanji. Our queer satsang dresses Hanumanji and does puja to him. So it's, my wife, who's more Hindu than me, although she's Anglo, she's dressed Hanumanji, right? And, and people sometimes have complained to me, and I'd be like, he's been celibate for like millions of years. And you really think that some random person touching him is going to make a difference to him? Like, that's about you. That's not about Hanumanji, right? That's your weirdness, not this thing. The other part, of course, is, and so that is this very, and Michel Foucault talks about heterotopias, where you create a space where you can have this difference. And I think it's important, whether it's, the temple you're talking about or, what Raja is doing with the work with specific ceremonies or communities, is to create bounded spaces where you can make this liberation happen. Now, is it perfect? Hell no. We screw up in many other dimensions, but there are some dimensions we do better on than others. And then it's really important to say that the second part is something like Hindus for Human Rights, right? It's to have this broader dialogue, this broader conversation, because otherwise the tendency is there's this one conversation going on and we are reacting to it. And I think what's important about this is that we are creating the new conversation. We are saying that the conversation we have to have is one of joy and love. And you cannot have joy and love when you're sitting out there dividing people by caste. You just can't, you know? I mean, that's antithetical. If I want joy and love, then I have to be political. I have to say this. I just want to end with a story, like with this on this bit. Like, I was remembering my mother embarrassed me terribly when I was young. Mothers tend to do that. That's part of the job of parents. And Aminta, I wish you well with that as you grow older and your children, go from adoring you to being embarrassed by you. But this was because we'd gone to this house to celebrate Christmas with the ayah who took care of my brother in school, right? And in India, in schools, you have teachers and you got the ayahs. And so we had gone to celebrate Christmas with the ayahs. And we went in there and we are sitting around the tree and, it's all sparkly and stuff. And we're young, right? I'm like fourth grade or something, my brother's second grade. And my mother asked for tea. And I'm shocked. Like, well, they didn't offer us chai or anything. Why would you ask for tea? And they look shocked. And my mother again asks for chai. And I'm like, Mom, what are you doing? Why would you do this? And what I didn't realize till many, many years later, of course, is that these were Dalit Christians. And so they didn't offer us chai because they were sure that if they did, they would be rebuffed. And my mother insisting that they give us chai was a way of her celebrating Christianity with them and celebrating Hinduism with them, which is, it's not an exclusive hierarchical practice. Hindu dharma is all about, lokaha samastha sukhino bhavantu. We all beings in all worlds be happy and peaceful. And I think that choice that we make, whether at a larger political advocacy level, in our temples, in our individual lives, I think those choices are critical for us to keep saying, we choose love, we choose beauty, we choose joy, and we build from that, not so much fighting against them, but really building this gorgeousness that we are all inheritors to.
Thank you so much, Punyaji. Rajaji.
I love, I think so for me, again, I do believe our actions are political, right? Our existence is political, and both from a queerness, right? My queerness is political. My brownness is political. My Asianness is political. My immigration status is political. My poetry is political. My rituals are political because we change and engage in these rituals. I officiated a wedding yesterday in Chicago, and in the middle of the ritual, typically the Hindu ceremony asks for the kanyadan. And I say, no, I don't do the kanyadan. It was a straight couple, and it was a straight interfaith couple. And I was like, I don't do kanyadan. I think that's silly that in 2025, we would treat women as property to be passed on. So I call the kutumba agaman, so welcoming into the family. So I think there's the power of the ritual looks similar, but I have both parents do the ritual. And we change the mantra to say, I welcome a new child. And by welcoming this child, I liberate my ancestors, rather than saying, I sacrifice my daughter and I liberate my ancestors, right? So that there's a reclamation. So I would say it's not reinvention, but it's a reclamation of what is the intentionality behind human relations and how is that connected to spiritual relationships, right? And to Punyaji's example, like when I go to India, I grew up with this Muslim family across the street from me for my whole life. And they're like, I knew them, auntie, I didn't even know her name, but it was just auntie, right? And her daughter and I were about the same age, we all were friends. But it was always this like, oh, and because I was like, they're just cool people. I like them more than my family, actually. And I make a point of going there every time I go and I sit and have chai. And they're like, do you want some tea? I'm like, yeah, let's sit. And everyone else is like, what, you're going to go have tea? I'm like, yeah. Like, they're nice to me. I'm nice to them. They care for me. I care for them. And I find it's community. And so for me to go in and sit and engage and have food, and even they're like, do you want to have some food? And I'm like, yeah, of course. I'm like, are you sure? I'm like, yeah, like I'm ready, I'm hungry. But it's interesting the way we are able to nourish in humanizing people becomes political now, which just feels so sad to reflect like the state of the Kali Yuga, that we need to actually humanize people by just being human, which feels just sad. But I think it's important. And the power of being able to, I think for me, I think about coming from this lineage of Hindu pundits and spiritual leaders and feeling my path has been to unlearn some of these practices and philosophies and actually re-engage to a more intuitive sense of my spirituality is in my DNA, is in my existence, and my sense of divinity within me, and that what I can do to help, like I do believe these rituals have become a part of my own spiritual practice in the world, that I help live out my spiritual purpose of helping people understand and reclaim the intentionality that is needed for these rituals, and not just the do this, do that, and you're married, or do this, do that, and they're dead, or do this, do that, and they move on to another world. It's like, but why are you doing this? What does it actually mean to? It's interesting that, particularly with death rituals and birth rituals. I mean, well, there's some, we haven't talked much about birth and the death pieces, right? Because some of the birth rituals, some, like most of the 16 rituals and that are required, the 15th is weddings and the 16th is death. The other 14 are like when you're really young, even before you're born. And part of it is like when the Pumsavasan, which is actually like asking the bride to make sure it's a boy, right? Like the way the patriarchy is built in so much that it's one of the 16 rituals that's required for you, that like your mother gets stuff put into her nose to make sure that the gods bless her with a boy. And it's like, well, what happens if it's not a boy? Do you just then, like, if the ritual half the time doesn't work, but you still do it, is it a silly ritual? Is it even meaningful? But also, what's the intentionality behind it? Is that the actual meaning behind why our rituals exist, right? And who created it? Is it serving a spiritual purpose to ask for a boy versus a girl, right? Or is it serving a practical or a human purpose, or is it serving a political purpose? And so even just asking those questions are really critical, right? And then you think about in death, in my family, especially when, particularly the day that someone's died, people come through, and all the families, regardless of who you are, you go and throw rice on the mouth, right? And it's like, okay, that's interesting if it's about the soul and not the spiritual, but then also all the danas that are required are all human related, are all physical things. You give the cow, you give the blanket, you give all these things that like are needed for the person in the journey. But it's like, and literally the first 10 days, or the first 9 days, is a spiritual creation of a spiritual body for the human, literally, right? So that as the spirit kind of goes into this pitra mode, the 9 days of rituals are literally forming the body that represents the 9 months in the mother's womb into the next spiritual body. And so as we're creating this spiritual body, and yet we're so connected to human form, it feels actually antithetical to the spiritual release of what we're looking for. If we're just saying you're going to go into this next lifetime with all these human things that you need, and the older they would have literally have sacrificed animals and beings, and similar to kind of what Egyptians would actually put animals and clothes and good and even in some more orthodox traditions, the fire pits that you use and the fire utensils, they'll put those with you in your fire. And so this interesting thing of like humanizing and kind of clinging to human needs, even in this idea of spirituality, feels antithetical. And so the antitheticalness and the dichotomousness we have not, and no one really wants to talk about. Even when I brought it up with my family, they're like, oh, well, you're just asking too many questions. And I'm like, but that's the whole point, right? Isn't that like, are we not asking, if the whole point is the spiritual journey, we come from nothing, we go to nothing, then why are we worried about all these things and all these rituals and all these pindas and all these, like the rituals that are both, and there's some spiritual meaning to say, it's helpful to provide a structure to mourn, which makes sense. I like that. Like, because in the time of mourning and bereavement, we need some structure to help us make sense of loss, even though we know it's going to happen to all of us, right? And at the same time, it feels so connected to human needs and patriarchal. Like, if we're not willing to question that, if we're not willing to question what happens to us when we die and how we are transitioned to death, are we actually able to live in this moment?
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for, I just want to make sure you can't hear the background noise, can you? Amazing. Okay, because there are screaming babies in the background. Um, and yeah, I mean, as somebody who has given birth, I have to reckon with a lot of these questions myself. I never thought that I could do that, and I did, and now I've got two almost 10-month-olds who are going to go through all of these rituals, and or some of them, the ones that we choose to perform. But my hope is that we can reimagine and reclaim so that their Hinduism doesn't feel co-opted um, by the politics that doesn't serve us as humanity. And so I just want to uplift some of what folks have been writing in the chat. Kanan wrote, here, don't bring politics into religion is like saying don't bring sourness into lemon. Absolutely. Radhika asks if anyone knows of a social justice-oriented pundit in Toronto, Canada. She'd be grateful for the recommendation. Lisa says, thank you so much, Punyaji. Not being political is political because it upholds the status quo of the current political climate. And Radhika also flags that she loves Rajaji's statement that my spirituality is in my DNA. So just want to uplift those comments and thank folks who have been staying on and listening to this conversation. There is one question that came from Deborah, and the question is, what are the death rights for women temple workers in the past and for brothel workers now, and why? So wild that the British brothels are still going and so extreme of a change from pre-British India. And so I'm not sure who amongst both of you would want to take that question. Or if you have any thoughts around this, and if you don't, that's also okay.
So I don't know anything about debt rights, just to be clear. I've got friends in India who've been working in two different areas on working with brothel workers, both to improve their health and also to give them options and to give their children more options. And that's been the focus of our discussions, really. But I do want to say that, Deborah's comment about the British sex camps, basically, brothels is much kinder work than what they did. They used to kidnap young women, 12, 13. And that's sort of one of the places where the menstruation concern comes in, because menstruation meant that they were now, quote unquote, ready, which is insane if you think about a 13-year-old or a 12-year-old. But that was sort of the signal when they would kidnap women and have them sign, quote unquote, these contracts for sexual servitude. And it was like a total company town, right? You had the whole thing where you had to pay for everything you did, paid out of the extremely low rates that they charged their troops to use these women. And the women didn't really have a choice. They were beaten and so on. And so this creation of an incredible large sexual industry was very much one of the gifts of the British that we tend to underrate. So I just want to affirm that, that is a sick piece that we have, then adapted and built, which of course we do, right? Human beings tend to adapt and build, and that's something that's really quite tragic. That is an ongoing issue and something, that we need to do more work on, do a lot more work on to help give people, make sex work safer and easier, make sex work not a default option for people just because of their family or where they came from, and then find ways to really take a look at helping people to treat them well in birth and death. So I think those are all really critical pieces. And yep, the comfort women piece, yes. Yes, the last one just recently passed. So yes, thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, I am not familiar specifically with the death rituals for temple women workers and brothel workers or sex workers. But I do, at least just anecdotally, that I've learned is it's put a lot on the other women in the community to really do a lot of it's interesting, right? Women have all these roles that they play in any funeral service, even if they're not allowed to be in some of these rituals and practices, and particularly in some of these more female-oriented spaces, there's a lot of female mourning. The other piece I think that's really interesting is around like hijras and trans people, and like where are death. A lot of it becomes a communal specific mourning practice that is separate from kind of these Hinduized Brahmanical rituals, which actually is kind of cool because it allows for us to decenter Brahmanical structures to actually think about death and mourning and actually create community-centered approaches, which feels actually quite liberatory. I think we can learn a lot by looking at temple women workers, sex workers, trans people, hijras, and the ways that they're thinking about these different practices, right? Yeah.
Thank you both so much. Do you have anything else to add before? I think there's
one more question.
Yes.
That's
I have a question. Let's see.
How do we get real about what patriarchy is costing us? Do you see that one?
Oh, no, I don't.
Oh, okay. That I can read it out. Another question from Deborah. How do we get real about what patriarchy is costing us? And by costing us, I mean costing men. The way it's talked about doesn't move us, and we are being tortured by this. There's no place and no way to express the unbearableness.
So if either of you want to take that. And thanks, Rajaji. I don't see it still.
It's in a bottom tab called Q&A next to the share button. That's what it is. So Deborah put that in.
I see. I see.
So I think, one of the concepts I really like is strategic essentialism. And my joke is that there are many places where I use my patriarchal benefits, privileges, powers to help others. And I think that's one choice that we need to make if you're going to be conscious about who we are, And let's be fair, pretty much any one of us on this, the fact that we have time on a Sunday morning to join in a conversation, there's a high level of economic privilege right there, right? Everything else being said, that's right there. So how do we strategically use our privilege to be liberatory? I think is a question for all of us, and it's a question for us on how we do this. One of the discussions at HfHR is, God, there's a lot of us Brahmins out here, right? My problem is a lot of South Indians, for heaven's sakes. As a North Indian, I'm like, feel very excluded. So, we can always find a zone to be excluded by, right? As against finding a way to say, oh, we're coming together. The other part of it is that, patriarchy really, really sucks for men. And I think that point is really valid and important. I was reading a blog by a trans person, and this person is female to male. And they said that, I would not believe how isolated and lonely men are if I hadn't actually been a woman before and knew this community of being a woman, of being connected. And I cannot tell you how strange and lonely it is. Now, I think part of that truly is American or Euro-modern men, because I think American men are far more isolated. My funniest thing was all my Western friends would be like, is like half the guys in India gay because they all walk around holding hands, right? And I was like, well, no, some of them may be, but most of them are just friends, right? Yeah. And there's a level of casual intimacy and friendship that is very different. And I think that the patriarchy does hurt men tremendously. It is a poison, and we think that it's privileging us, but it's not. It is giving us a lot of poison with a little bit of medicine. And I think it's important for us to talk about that and how that crushes us. And I think this actually is where the concept of moksha comes in, because this is where you're saying that, if you want freedom, then part of the freedom you're getting is freedom from that poison that is shaping you in terms of quote unquote what's desirable or what it is to be a man. And that freedom is so important for us. And that comes from letting go of this poison that is quote unquote my ladder. So hopefully that helped address some of what you were saying, Deborah. I'm not sure that that's, bang on what you're asking, but hopefully it's in this ballpark.
I think often the work is left to people who are oppressed to do the education and liberation work. And I think if we really think about helping men understand the pain and impact of patriarchy, we have to actually get them to undo it themselves and choose to do that work. And so we have to create the conditions where humanity and emotionality is not just seen as a feminine trait, but actually a human trait, right? And that emotions and feelings. I mean, I think about how many people talked about Hillary Clinton or Kamala being too emotional, and yet we think about like what are our current administrations doing and the decisions that are being made and the way the rants are done. Like that's actually much worse, and we've been ruled by how long for men in this world, and we're not better for it. So I think there is something to be said around that part, but I think it actually goes to raising people. I think parenting is so critical from these rituals. Like, why are we doing the Pumsavasanam when we're literally saying we want to, I'm going to give you all these spices in your nose so that we have a boy, right? And so structurally we are saying boys are more important than girls. And that if we don't have one, or I mean, we know that infanticide is, or at least femicide is still technically illegal in India, but we know it happens, right? And we know that like women are treated differently, and that women are often used and are co-conspirators in the oppression of other people as women in the way that we do political. I have a niece that's 7 years old, and the number of times my sister tells her to sit like a woman, right, or like to act like, just the ways that we use oppression to refine our own oppression because we haven't had chances to heal. And so what does that mean to be able to kind of create space to understand that? So I think there's something around one, do we just remove one of the rituals? If the rituals have changed across the board, do we just remove some of them? Like I love the pieces around we want a healthy child to be born. That's great. We want a healthy relationship. We want a healthy fertilization. That's great. But maybe Pum Savasana isn't necessary, right? Maybe that's one of the rituals that doesn't make sense anymore, right? Or if we think about the marriage rituals, for me, I think about typically when I officiate weddings, I usually have, you know, the traditional version says the groom comes in a heteronormative context, and then we do queer rituals. It's all up across the board. And I'm like, well, we get to choose because there's all these things that we can do. So because like tradition is made up, and so we get to then play with the traditions. But in a heteronormative context, typically I have the groom walk down, and the bride will meet the groom at the front of the mandap, and they walk in together. Because for me, I'm like, because that's your house. If you have the bride going to the groom's house, there's still a power difference. So how do we patriarchalize, if that's a word, that even just a little simple ritual like that, right? And to talk about why that's important, or as you talk to families and say, why is this person, you know, if in the traditional Hindu ceremony, the groom goes around the fire 3 times and the bride leads the fourth, and it's like, well, that's silly. Why don't we do 2 and 2? And what does that look like? How do we question? Again, the asking questions is really critical, and then the understanding the why and the intention is really important, right? To know that those two, the what are we doing and why are we doing, those 2 questions can transform our liberatory practice. And I think we need to get more, particularly male identified folks, put up people across the board to ask the question, why are we doing these things? Why do we, you know, why do some women when you go to the temple required to put their dupattas on their heads, and why do men don't have to do that? Like, what is that? Like, again, this idea of politeness, this idea of making oneself smaller, or being. And then when we talk about God, why do we talk about God as a masculine person, when in our tradition that's not actually Gayatri and Shakti is more powerful than any of the 3 gods combined, and yet we don't talk about her as the ultimate power, right? And yet we talk about femininity as a sacred power, and we'll also then allow for domestic abuse to be incredibly high in our cultures. And so the contradictions, I think, has to be addressed, and has to be like, and speaking about it and naming it is part of the work, right? You know, in my consulting work, I talk about, you know, paying attention now, and like saying, oh, I noticed this is happening. What is that? And to just make people, even just naming what's happening is a critical way that we can start to identify the themes and the patterns, which then allows us to then say, I noticed that you're really angry with blank, 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 and you act differently with these women than you do with these men. What does that look like? And so to kind of start to name those practices, but then also think about, like, we have power, particularly in our conversations, to say, why do we do this? What does this look like? And who is allowed, who's not allowed? And I think the piece around dressing Hanumanji is really powerful, right? To say who has the rights to go in and not in, and what does that look like? One of my favorite stories of South Indian, I'm sorry, Punyaji, South Indian mythology is Purandaradasa, no, I think it might be Kanakadasa, don't quote me on this, in Udupi, where he's not allowed to go into the main temple, and so he's at the back of the temple to singing to Krishna, and the murti itself shifts. So it's one of the few murtis where it's actually turned backwards, and because and so that's when Kanakadasa becomes kind of sanctified, and people recognize that devotion and bhakti does not have gender, sex, class, creed, varna, etc. God is God, and God listens to, particularly in the Bhakti Yoga tradition, right? A Bhakti movement, God listens to you, that when you offer your love, and that love is genderless, love is sexless, love is casteless, and that he's literally turning a stone around for his deities. And so, like, what more power do we need to recognize that the emotional connection of being able to surrender yourself to divinity, and to be able to offer yourself to the divine, and to be able to accept the divine as they are, as you want to be accepted, is how we create liberation in our work.
Such beautiful and inspirational words to close off with. But we have one more question. And this question comes from Sunita. And I think it's an important question for those of us who are in the organizing space, in the advocacy space, as far as where do we go from here? So this is important work. Obviously, we're talking about reclaiming and reimagining a way to be both Hindu and loving. So certainly not contradictory. We can totally do that. And do you think that this work is happening in India, or is it more so happening in the diaspora? And then to close off for both of you, if you have any guiding words for Hindus for Human Rights, sadhana, and other similar liberatory efforts that are happening in the United States, across the world. And we will close with that. So I will turn it over to both of you, whoever wants to go first.
So thank you. I think one thing to remember about the dharma, the Sanatan dharma, is that there is a quote unquote Sanatan dharma, which is eternal and so on. And that dharma is liberatory. So by definition, the dharma is liberatory. It is not meant to be oppressive. Now, because we're humans and we will screw up anything we can, it is also oppressive. But the tendency of being liberatory has been essential to the dharma over decades. And of course, Raja talked about the bhakti movements, and you just mentioned this wonderful story of the saint. I love that story, even if it's from South India, what to do. But I think that the questions are everywhere. That the sense of liberation, the sense that we create this, is really important. There are contemporary saints in India today who are doing amazing work. Amma Mata Amritanandmayi is one, but there's many others who are doing this amazing work of saying the dharma is not defined by old strictures, right? The dharma is defined by potential, by our freedom, and by the sense of moksha and so on. And I think it's really important to celebrate that. And I don't think it matters where it's happening more or less. I think India is just so much larger than the diaspora. I'm assuming a lot more is happening there. The question is, how do we support each other as we do this? So how do we make friends? How do we make family? How do we support each other? Because your version of liberation may not be the same version that I want or I like, but I can still support it and celebrate it. And I think that's really important for us to be generous. I think a lot of times in spaces that are progressive or are, looking for justice, that there's a question of our own sense of purity, right? That are you woke enough? Are you liberated enough? Are you something enough? And I think we let go of that and really support each other wherever we are on our journey, whether it's step 1 or step 2000, to find ways to be family and celebrate that and to help each other build this voice so that, we do what we're supposed to do as good Hindus, which is question, celebrate, and make us more focused on love and beauty.
I love all that. I do think it's happening in India. I think it's harder to see because Hinduism is so much more infused into the day-to-day, so that even those acts of challenging and questioning is normalized because there's so many versions that a small change isn't. It's like a drop of water in the ocean doesn't make a difference, but a drop of water in the desert does. Right. And so I think there's a difference in like the way that changes. I think Hinduism is allowed to evolve much quicker in South Asia than it is in the diaspora. I think a diasporic, we're kind of stuck 30 years behind where South Asia is, because there's a need to kind of hold on to these systems and structures because we're kind of isolated and feel like we're in smaller pockets. So we feel the need to hold on to that because it's familiar. At the same time, I think the progressiveness doesn't get acknowledged in South Asia because of the fear of what the larger system can do in the oppressive political and cultural systems that are at play, and the overwhelmingness that you feel. And even when I go to India, when I was just there for 5 weeks in earlier part of this year, and it's like I feel different. I can't feel like I can be myself in my queerness, in my brownness, in my desiness, in my Hindu-ness, because the systems are so much more like everyone believes in it, and so it's just harder to question and challenge it. So I think it's harder, but it's happening more often. But it also gets unrecognized, or gets often done in a way that's so subtle that change like a glacial pace, but still shifting. We just don't see it until if you are able to zoom out. So the beauty of being diasporic people that kind of go across And then the other piece, then we also are forgetting, like, between the US and India, there's a lot of other diasporic communities that are in the middle that have actually done a lot of work to get us to where we are, right? I think about the folks that were in Eastern Africa and the Caribbean and the ways that we've allowed to exist as Hinduism in the US now, which is much younger than other parts of the diaspora. That's really transformed the way we think. So I think I also like that there's a middle piece that needs to happen as well of how the work, I feel like the work that's happening in the diasporic places that are not the US are more informative to us now than what's happening in South Asia. That might be, I don't, I'm just thinking about it now, but I think that I'd probably put money behind that. The other piece, I'm also going to ask, and just check in on Deborah's question really quickly. She's talking about how is rape reshaping death and birth, when the extent of rape and how much rape is rape, stuff. Yeah, I mean, there's different practices, right? Some earlier scriptures say then you have to marry this woman and you have to and then that's like that somehow seems a punishment to the man, but it's like that's actually putting something of this woman to be harmed for the rest of her freaking life, which is terrible. So I think that's shifting a little bit, but the commonality of rape, particularly in South Asia and kind of the highly publicized cases in the last couple of years, I think is somewhat a good sign, right? It's like I used to work on college campuses, so when we started to collect sexual violence report, people are like, oh my God, there's so much sexual violence. It's like, no, it's been happening. It's just we're now collecting numbers, so we actually know what's happening. So you can't actually do something if you don't want to know the actual numbers. I think there is something to recognize that knowing more about these that are happening is helpful, and also creates conversation to say, what does this mean for us as a culture where we say the Matru Shakti, Matru is so important and the mother's energy is so critical, and yet we also can defile women without any repercussion. But we see that it's not an Indian problem, it's not a Hindu problem, it's a universal problem, unfortunately. And we're seeing that in the US very firsthand at this point of how the experience and impact on sexual violence against women is seen so lightly, and yet at the same time women's humanity and women's leadership skills are being questioned. So this is really interesting. You're too much and too little all at the same time, I think is definitely there, right? And then guiding words. I believe these conversations are critical. These questions are critical. Knowing why we're doing something and what we're doing and who we're doing it with is increasingly and extremely important. And I would second Punyaji's point that, like, we don't need everyone to think where we are. I'm not going to get any of my family to think of Hinduism the way I think about it, but my question is to still get them to complicate it a little bit. So progress, not perfection. That's always been the foundation of our whole sense of humanity and Atma, right? It's about understanding our divinity, which is progress and understanding our connectedness, and then the ability to release our attachments to human needs.
Thank you so much, Rajaji and Punyaji, for what was a deeply enlightening conversation. And I think I'm leaving with more questions than answers, but I think that's the whole point, right? As we delve deeper into what it means to be Hindu, what it means to be a good person, how those overlap, and what moksha can look like for us. I want to again close by saying I'm so honored to have been given the opportunity to be alongside both of you in this conversation. I hope this isn't the first and the last time we get to meet in this type of space, and that we can continue to grow a movement of like-minded Hindus here and wherever such like-minded Hindus want to gather. I want to thank Sunita again for her mentorship of me over the years, and for founding an organization like Hindus for Human Rights, because it is much needed. And I hope this work can continue to reach the masses. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the amazing Mayank, who has done so much work in putting this Baithak together. And Mayank will say a bit more about HfHR and just leave closing remarks with us. Thank you once more, everyone, for joining this conversation.